It started with a sentence so casual, so confident, that no one in the room laughed, because it wasn't meant as a joke. "Filipinos can't play football," the Spanish coach said, arms folded, eyes scanning the dusty training field like he'd already seen enough. The words hung in the humid air, heavier than the heat itself. Some of the players looked down at their boots. Others clenched their jaws. A few smiled politely, the way Filipinos often do when respect demands silence, even as pride takes a hit. What the coach didn't realize was that he had just lit a fuse. Not of anger alone, but of memory, history, and something deeper. An unshakable hunger to prove that identity is not defined by stereotypes. Because for these players, football wasn't just a sport. It was a chance to be seen. The coach wasn't a nobody. He came from Spain, a country that breathes football the way lungs breathe air. He had trained youth academies tied to La Liga clubs, studied under systems that produced world-class midfielders and tactical geniuses. When he arrived in Southeast Asia to consult and observe, his resume spoke louder than his accent. Many expected inspiration, maybe even validation. Instead, what they heard felt like a verdict. He compared physiques, pointed out height differences, mocked the lack of grassroots football culture. "Basketball suits you better," he added, almost helpfully. To him it was analysis. To the players it was dismissal. And yet, beneath the sting of his words, something else stirred. Because every Filipino in that field had heard versions of this before, not just in sports, but in life. To understand why those words cut so deep, you have to understand the Filipino relationship with being underestimated. For decades, Filipinos have been told they're too small, too soft-spoken, too accommodating to dominate global stages. In basketball courts, offices, ships, hospitals, and construction sites abroad, they're often praised for hard work but rarely expected to lead. Football was no different. While Europe glorified academies and South America idolized street football, the Philippines grew up juggling makeshift goals, cracked fields, and second-hand boots. There was no national obsession, no packed stadiums, no guaranteed future. Yet what existed instead was adaptability, the ability to learn fast, work twice as hard, and carry hope quietly. The coach saw absence. He didn't see potential. The players on that field were not professionals living glamorous lives. Some were students balancing training with exams. Others worked night shifts, then showed up exhausted but determined. One was sending money home to a province still recovering from a typhoon. Another had parents who thought football was a waste of time compared to a real job. They trained under flickering floodlights, on uneven grass, sometimes without proper medical staff. Still they came early and stayed late. They taped their own ankles, washed their own kits, and studied YouTube clips of European matches on cracked phone screens. When the Spanish coach spoke, he saw a group lacking polish. What he didn't see was sacrifice. Instead of arguing, the team did what Filipinos often do best. They listened. Quietly. Respectfully. The coach outlined drills, criticized positioning, scoffed at first touches. He spoke of tempo, spatial awareness, tactical discipline. And something unexpected happened. The players absorbed everything. They asked questions. They took notes. They stayed after training to repeat drills until their legs burned. While the coach thought he was confirming his beliefs, the team was building something else entirely. Understanding. Football IQ doesn't come from birthplace alone. It comes from learning. And night after night, under buzzing lights and tired skies, the players began to change. Their passes sharpened. Their movements synced. Their confidence grew. Not loudly but steadily. Outside the pitch, word of the coach's comments spread quietly through local football circles. Some were angry. Others shrugged, saying it was nothing new. But among former players and young fans, something electric was happening. Social media posts appeared, not attacking the coach, but sharing clips of Filipino teams, street games, old national highlights. "We've always played," one caption read. "You just never watched." Parents who once doubted began showing up at practices. Kids lingered by fences mimicking drills. Football, long overshadowed by basketball courts, was suddenly being talked about again, not as a joke, but as a possibility. The real test came sooner than anyone expected. A friendly match was scheduled against a visiting side made up of academy-trained players. Taller, faster, louder. The Spanish coach watched from the sideline, arms crossed again, expecting a lesson to be learned the hard way. The opening minutes were rough. The Filipinos absorbed pressure, chased shadows, missed chances. But they didn't panic. They adjusted. They communicated. They remembered the drills. By halftime, the scoreline was still level, and something had shifted. The opponents looked confused. The coach leaned forward. For the first time, doubt crept into his certainty. In the second half, the Filipinos played with a rhythm that surprised everyone, including themselves. Quick one-touch passes. Smart overlapping runs. Defensive discipline that came not from brute strength, but from reading the game. When the first goal came, it wasn't flashy. It was earned. A build-up that started from the back, patience over power. The bench erupted. Not in arrogance, but in disbelief. The Spanish coach stood still. This wasn't supposed to happen. These weren't the players he had dismissed. These were players who listened, adapted, and executed. And suddenly, the narrative he had carried so confidently began to crack. The match ended with the Filipinos walking off the pitch exhausted, muddy, and smiling in a way that needed no translation. They hadn't just won a game. They had confronted an assumption. The coach didn't speak immediately. He watched them celebrate, noticed the way they thanked referees, shook hands, helped opponents up. Later, quietly, he admitted something to an assistant. They learn fast. It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning. For the players, that was enough. They weren't chasing validation anymore. They had felt it in their legs, their lungs, their teamwork. Proof doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with silence. That moment didn't magically change Filipino football overnight. Stadiums didn't fill instantly. Sponsors didn't rush in. But something important had shifted internally. The players carried themselves differently. They trained with intention. They spoke to younger kids with confidence instead of apology. And the story began to grow, not as a headline, but as a quiet challenge to anyone still holding outdated beliefs. Because what happened next wasn't shocking because Filipinos won a match. It was shocking because once given a chance to learn, they refused to accept the limits placed on them. And this was only the beginning. In the days that followed that match, training sessions felt different. The same field, the same heat, the same worn-out cones. But the atmosphere had shifted. The players arrived earlier, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. There was less nervous laughter and more focused silence. Mistakes still happened, but now they were corrected instantly, without blame. The Spanish coach noticed it too. His instructions became sharper, less dismissive. He began stopping drills not just to criticize but to explain. For the first time, he treated the group not as a limitation but as a project. And for the players, that subtle change meant everything. Respect, once withheld, was slowly being earned through performance. What many outsiders failed to understand was how naturally football fit into the Filipino way of thinking once it was properly taught. Filipinos grow up in close-knit communities, where awareness of others comes instinctively. On the pitch, this translated into unselfish play. Quick passes instead of solo runs, covering for teammates without being asked. The coach began pointing this out during film sessions, almost surprised. "You see space well," he said once, pausing a replay. That comment spread through the room like electricity. It wasn't loud praise, but it was acknowledgement. The same trait once labeled as being too passive was now revealing itself as tactical intelligence. As weeks passed, the team was invited to participate in a regional tournament. Nothing glamorous, no television cameras, just competitive matches against clubs that had been playing together for years. Expectations were low. The Filipinos were considered fillers, a developmental side meant to gain experience and bow out early. Even some local organizers quietly assumed they'd be outmatched. But inside the locker room, there was no talk of fear. There was only preparation. Players studied opponents, discussed formations, and visualized scenarios. They weren't chasing miracles. They were chasing execution. The opening tournament match was tense. Every tackle felt heavier, every pass carried risk. When the Filipinos conceded first, old doubts tried to creep back in. This was the moment stereotypes usually reasserted themselves, the moment when people expected collapse. Instead, the team reset. They communicated calmly, adjusted their shape, and trusted the process they'd been drilling for weeks. The equalizer came just before halftime, born from patience rather than panic. And in that moment, something snapped for the opponents. They had expected resistance, not resilience. By the second match, whispers began circulating on the sidelines. Coaches leaned in closer. Spectators stayed longer. The Filipinos weren't just surviving, they were controlling stretches of play. They pressed intelligently, conserved energy, and punished mistakes with efficiency. There were no flashy celebrations, no trash talk, just quiet intensity. One opposing coach was overheard saying, "They don't play like beginners." That sentence, simple as it was, carried more weight than any online argument ever could. It meant minds were changing in real time. The Spanish coach, once so certain, now found himself defending his players in technical meetings. When others questioned their physicality, he countered with data. Distance covered, successful recoveries, passing accuracy. Numbers didn't lie. The team was outperforming expectations on every measurable level. Privately, he began re-examining his own assumptions. He realized that his earlier judgment wasn't rooted in evidence, but in exposure. He hadn't seen enough Filipino football to understand it. And now, standing among colleagues who were slowly being convinced, he understood how dangerous a single unchecked belief could be. Back home, news trickled through social media. Not viral headlines but shared clips and quiet pride. Young players reposted goals. Parents sent messages of support. Former athletes who had given up on football commented with disbelief and hope. For a country long accustomed to cheering for imported leagues, something new was happening. Filipinos were starting to look inward for heroes. Kids in provinces began setting up makeshift goals again, copying drills they saw online. Football wasn't replacing basketball, but it was finally standing beside it. The tournament semi-finals pushed the team to its limits. Injuries piled up. Fatigue became unavoidable. Yet the players adapted again, rotating roles, sacrificing individual comfort for collective survival. One midfielder played out of position without complaint. A defender pushed through cramps until the final whistle. These weren't superstars, they were teammates. When the final whistle blew and the Filipinos advanced, there was no dramatic celebration. Just deep breaths, hugs, and the quiet realization that they had gone farther than anyone expected, including themselves. In the final match, they faced the tournament favorites, a team known for dominance, physicality, and confidence. The stadium, small as it was, leaned heavily toward the other side. From the opening whistle, the Filipinos were tested. They conceded early, then again. 2 goals down, exhaustion visible, doubt knocking loudly. This was the moment that would define everything. Not the scoreline but the response. And the response came not in panic, but in belief. They kept playing, kept pressing, kept trusting. The comeback didn't come easily. It came through grit, discipline, and refusal to surrender identity. One goal, then another. When the equalizer hit the net, even neutral spectators stood. The match eventually went to penalties, where anything can happen. Win or lose, the message was already clear. These players belonged here. The Spanish coach watched, heart pounding, knowing that whatever the outcome, his original statement no longer held any truth. What he was witnessing wasn't shocking talent. It was the result of opportunity meeting determination. The penalty shootout felt endless. Each kick carried more than the weight of the match. It carried years of doubt, quiet sacrifices, and unheard ambition. When the final penalty was saved, the scoreboard told a story few had predicted. The Filipinos had done it. Not through dominance but through composure. Some players dropped to their knees. Others stared into the night sky, almost stunned by what they had just accomplished. There were no choreographed celebrations, no chest thumping. Just raw emotion spilling out in small human ways. On the sideline, the Spanish coach stood motionless, hands on his head. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about tactics or technique. He was thinking about how wrong he had been. Later that night, away from cameras and crowds, the coach spoke to the team. His tone was different, quieter, stripped of authority. He didn't give a dramatic apology, but he didn't need to. "I underestimated you," he said simply. For the players, those words mattered more than praise ever could. It wasn't about proving him wrong anymore. It was about being seen clearly. Respect, once earned, doesn't need to be demanded. It settles into the room naturally. That conversation marked a turning point, not just for the coach but for everyone who had witnessed the journey. The tournament ended, but its impact didn't. Invitations followed, training camps, friendlies, development programs. Not because of hype, but because people had watched closely. Scouts began asking questions. Analysts revisited old assumptions. The Filipinos weren't being framed as underdogs anymore, but as learners with upside. That distinction mattered. It shifted the narrative from pity to potential. And for the players, it reinforced a powerful lesson. Doors don't always open with noise. Sometimes they open because consistency becomes impossible to ignore. For many of the players, the experience changed how they saw themselves beyond football. Confidence crept into classrooms, workplaces, and family conversations. Parents who once discouraged training now asked about schedules. Younger siblings started wearing boots instead of slippers on dusty fields. The idea that "this isn't for us" began to fade. Football had become a mirror, reflecting what happens when Filipinos are given structure, trust, and time. Not instant greatness, but steady growth. The Spanish coach returned home with a different story than the one he arrived with. In conversations with colleagues, he spoke less about limitations and more about adaptability. He admitted that talent isn't exclusive to traditional powerhouses. It's often hidden behind lack of exposure. In private moments, he reflected on how easy it is to confuse familiarity with superiority. His statement, once casual and confident, had unraveled under the simplest test, reality. And that realization stayed with him longer than any trophy. The story spread quietly, carried not by headlines but by example. Coaches began rethinking how they approached Southeast Asian players. Youth programs looked inward, investing more seriously in football development. It wasn't a revolution, but it was movement. Step by step, field by field, belief began replacing hesitation. The Filipinos hadn't shattered the football world. They had done something far more powerful. They had forced it to look again. What made the journey relatable wasn't the final score or the medals. It was the struggle. Anyone who has ever been underestimated at work, in school, or in life could recognize it instantly. The feeling of being judged before being understood. Of being told where you belong before you've had a chance to try. Football was just the stage. The real story was about dignity. About refusing to accept ceilings built by other people's limited views. Today, if you visit certain fields in the Philippines, you'll see kids training with intention. Not pretending to be stars but dreaming realistically. Coaches breaking down formations. Players studying positioning. It's not perfect. Resources are still limited. Challenges remain. But the mindset is different. The question is no longer, can we play football? It's, how good can we become if we keep going? The Spanish coach's words once echoed as a dismissal. Now they echo as a reminder of how dangerous assumptions can be. Filipinos didn't need validation from Europe to play football. They needed opportunity, patience, and belief. Once those elements aligned, the results spoke louder than any accent or resume ever could. The shocking part wasn't the upset victory. It was how predictable the outcome became once the playing field was truly level. So when people ask what really happened after a Spanish coach said Filipinos can't play soccer, the answer is simple. They played. They learned. They endured. And they proved that talent is not owned by geography, size, or tradition. It grows wherever determination is allowed to breathe. This wasn't a miracle story. It was a human one. And its message travels far beyond the pitch. Never confuse silence with inability, because some people are just waiting for the chance to speak through action. Thanks for watching.